Before discussing why I believe this book, I'll be reviewing contemporary human cosmology, which would include Einstein's relativity theory and the Big Bang, for sure. Let's see if... So, when Copernicus overthrew the Earth-centered system of the sun, moon, and stars, and the planets, he replaced the Earth with the sun as the center of the solar system. Again, when our astronomers overthrew the sun as the center of the known cosmos, they replaced it with the galactic center of the Milky Way. They did not do away altogether with a center. It was Albert Einstein who lost sight of the cosmic center. When purely on aesthetic grounds, he arbitrarily ruled out all solutions to his field equations if there were any special frame of reference, like a center. Kurt Gödel, a logician, later supplied a solution to those field equations that has a center. So let's read these together. The Big Bang explosion, the evidence for it is basically the huge observed red shifts of the characteristic radiation frequencies that are interpreted as due to the receding velocities of light emitters. And greater observed redshifts at greater distances are interpreted as basically an explosion. And by projecting back, the velocity was zero at about 3.7 billion years. And then the other basic piece of information, evidence, is the cosmic microwave background radiation. CMB has been previously observed to be isotropic, which means the same in all directions. And that's consistent with an explosion. Later, after the model has been looked at for a while, it became necessary to make some adjustments. First of all, the initial rapid expansion of space, not just the matter in space, to account for how matter quickly separated to a distance of 3.7 billion light years, and now the light's finally getting back to us. How did it separate so far, so fast? Then they needed a little something called inflation to account for the fact that if there's an explosion, you don't get galaxies out there in outer space, which we observed in the 90s. So they had to say that, well, a little bit after the explosion, there was some clumping of the matter by gravity, which then became galaxies that old. Well, that wasn't all the patches. We had to have another one when dark matter was invented to account for the observed very rapid spin of galaxies. Dark energy showed up when we realized that the expansion that's occurring is accelerating. That threw a wrench into the thing. So now we have dark matter, which is supposed to be over 90%. Of course, now with dark energy, there's sort of a combination. And it's supposed to be somehow energy that's being put into the system that's making the universe expand faster, accelerating. And finally, we have a multi-universe idea, and I think this accounts for all possibilities. You can, the people say, well, what happened? What was here before the Big Bang? So now we're talking about parallel universes. Maybe there's all possibilities happening, and we're just one of them. So you don't have to explain anything unusual, because if there's something unusual here, well, it's probably not unusual someplace else. Nothing else to explain. End of story. maybe we need some help with our cosmology. Maybe we've gotten to a point where we're really struggling. Here are some implications of contemporary cosmology. If the rapid expansion of space allowed matter to quickly appear far apart, 13.7 billion light years away, then faster than the speed of light, space can carry energies which can emerge as matter in distant places. That seems to be an implication. And maybe that's true. We see that things are very flat. The galaxies are flat. The Milky Way is flat. Solar systems are basically flat. Very, very rapid rotations. That's why we need the dark matter to hold it together. If you didn't have some more matter in there, the luminous bodies would just fly apart. So we got to have some dark matter. We got to have the dark energy again so that we can explain acceleration of space expansion. But that's dark work. It's not really moving matter, it's moving space. So let's take a closer look at the problems with contemporary cosmology. The Big Bang explosion is based on the cosmic microwave background radiation, but recently there's been observation that there is a preferred axis in the background radiation. And I've got a couple of links here, recent ones, that indicate that they've reconfirmed the data that recently was not as well established. And sure enough, this evil axis doesn't want to go away. They called it an evil axis because it would do damage to the existing cosmology, not because there was anything evil about it. And now instruments have measured that not only isn't it isotropic, which means the same in all directions, but it appears to be that they've measured significantly more energy on one side of the hemisphere as on the other one. Now, you know, it's down there in the 0.00057 range, so we've gotten very good measurements. But there seems to be a little more energy on one side than the other, and it's significant. Can't be by accident. Well, these are things that the Urantia Book says. It says that it's possible to establish absolute direction in the cosmos, that there is an axis, and north has a little more energy than south. And once you know up and down, and you know north and south, you know east and west. So the Urantia Book says there is a center, and the center even has north and south, east and west. And I've got this data, and here's a quote that I thought was impressive enough to include. This is recent research, and this fellow is couching things pretty carefully. But you'll notice at the end, he says, you know, we've noticed this axis, and we've noticed this difference in energy. He said, well, the true isotropic model is likely to be more complicated and might contain higher order monopoles, whatever that means. But in other words, he didn't want to flatly say, you know, this is a problem that we need to rethink the cosmological principle. They suggested a violation of the cosmological principle is going on here, and maybe there's some kind of an adjustment that we can make. Well, let's go on to the Urantia Cosmology. Cosmology, the Urantia Book, is supposedly not inspired. They say it is not inspired. But they also say it is of immense value, a statement that seems to always be avoided or missed when people are qualifying the Urantia Book's cosmology. There's a lot of people saying, well, the cosmology is rewarmed 20th century science. They couldn't tell us anything we didn't already know. Very simplistically, I think, not giving credit to the revelators for being able to find the middle ground. Well, here's what they say. Truth may be relatively inspired, even though revelation is invariably a spiritual phenomenon. While the statements with respect to cosmology are never inspired, such revelations are of immense value in that they at least transiently clarify knowledge by the reduction of confusion, by the authoritative elimination of error. Now, I submit that if you're going to give us rewarmed 20th century science, you're not going to be able to give us an authoritative elimination of error. Here are 4 other things that they say they did. This is what they were supposed to do. The coordination of known and about to be known facts and observations. The restoration of important bits of lost knowledge concerning epochal transactions in the distant past. Supplying of information which will fill in vital missing links, missing gaps in otherwise earned information. It's obviously something we don't have. They're going to give it to us because we've got everything around it. And they're trying to present this cosmic information in a manner that will illustrate and make easier to understand the spiritual teachings. So here's the statement in the Urantia Book, and I couldn't put it all in, but this is the crux of it. These difference in dimensions, taken in connection with it, paradise referring to, and I'll talk about what paradise is, stationary status, and the greater outpressure of force energy at the north end of the aisle make it possible to establish absolute direction in the master universe. There's a cosmic axis, up and down, and there's north and south, east and west. Here's an artistic rendition of the master universe, and Byron went over it pretty well. I think it's worth, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, with the Urantia Book, to I'll go over this once more. Outside, they have these 4 outer space zones. And by the way, the distances here between, this distance of just this zone is about 50 million light years. And then, this gap is another, 10, 20 million light years. So, and the distance between these super universes and the first outer space level is on the order of 1 million light years. The Urantia Book says it's the light took almost 1 million years to get here, whereas contemporary science says we now have the thing at about 2.5 million light years. Of course, we're always adjusting our numbers, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if they say, hey, we thought this, but now it's something else. So these are the 7 super universes, which really would have to be within the Milky Way. I say within or behind it. It's all in that streak of light, if you're in a dark sky, that stretches more than halfway across the sky. That has to be where all of these are. And then there's this is the 7 circuits of Havona, and they are in space. Billion worlds. Then there's the 3 circuits of the fathers of the worlds, and there's 21 of them. And then they have depicted the flat ellipsoidal paradise. Now, people say, well, where is paradise? And the answer to that, according to the Urantia Book, is it's at the focus of space. That space has a focus. And they describe how there's pervaded space with matter in it, and then there's mid-space zones. Think of it this way. All matter has space inside of it. All matter has space inside of it. Not all space is in matter, but all matter is in space. So inside of all the matter, there are these zones that are not moving. There's zones that are moving, and then there are non-moving zones. And as you move closer to the center of any particle, there's a lot of space in there. And that space isn't moving, it's the other parts that are moving. And they say if you take those non-moving parts and you focus in on them, they will impinge on peripheral paradise. That these mid-space zones will actually impinge on the periphery of paradise. It's been mentioned earlier that there's an inner-outer personal philosophy of reality in the Urantia Book. Facts, science, and truth. Science and religion. Mathematics and volition. Matter and spirit. That's very, very important in the Urantia Book's cosmology. There's a material plane, absolute gravitational center called paradise. There's the unqualified absolute, and there are 7 absolutes of infinity in the Urantia Book. 3 personal, the Father, the eternal Mother, Son, and the infinite Spirit. There's paradise, which is an absolute, and it sort of can connote any type of reality because God is in paradise. And paradise seems to be able to have a pattern, its pattern throughout space. The unqualified absolute, they say, pervades space and then even goes beyond space, and that it releases force energy into space. And then there are some transcendental force organizers who take that force energy and start it to be attracted by paradise as a global phenomenon. Then they talk about a second phase in which the second level of these transcendental force organizers take this force and turn it into particles, ultimate particles, the smallest particles. They call them ultimatons. These ultimatons don't attract one another. They refer to that as linear gravity. They have just paradise gravity. Urantia Book has 2 kinds of gravity, paradise gravity and linear gravity. Now, I take paradise gravity as the center of the cosmos and the center of each ultimate particle. The Urantia Book specifically says that the ultimate particles, these ultimatons, have paradise as their nucleus. And I think that paradise holds the ultimaton together. They also say that the ultimaton is a minute sphere. It has axial rotations. And if you have axial rotations, it sounds to me as though you're spinning on an axis that goes through the ultimaton. So what keeps it together? Why doesn't it fly apart? Paradise gravity. The Urantia Book talks about how the inside area, this area that I pointed to earlier, where Havona is in space and paradise is there, but we can't see it. And they refer to the fact that there are some dark gravity bodies which are unique that neither absorb light nor reflect it. And that seemed like, well, that's a strange thing, something that doesn't absorb light, it doesn't reflect light. What else is there? Well, it could go around. And now we have actually done this. Our scientists have done this on small scale. They've made something disappear by having the light just go around it. So you look and you say, oh, there's a star there, but you actually, it's like the cloaking device. Remember in Star Wars? I think he definitely was a reader of the Urantia Book, by the way. So the Urantia Book talks about how the center is cloaked with these dark gravity bodies that make it invisible to us. Now, there's some evidence that there is some kind of a great attractor, that everything is somehow going around. I'm talking about contemporary evidence. They don't see anything there, but there must be something big there because things are going around it. So I've talked about this already, rapid internal orbits and orbits that are around the whole cosmos versus, axial spins. There are two kinds, an orbit has to move around something else. A spin is on its axis, so it's spinning within itself. It's like, solar system. The Earth spins on its axis, but it also orbits the sun. Everything else, all matter seems to be the same way. All energy is the same thing. The Urantia Book says that the material universe is growing, but it's not exploding. So I guess I've said this already. I'm going to continue going. Let me get into why I believe this Urantia Book. I also had a very low ambiguity tolerance. And I wanted to know things, and when I finally found the Urantia Book, I realized that I knew this was it. The reason I believe it, besides the spiritual value, is that it has predicted many scientifically implausible things in 1955, subsequently verified by our scientists. And they've done this better than our scientists, and they've avoided the systematic errors that our scientists have fallen into. And I'm going to give you some examples. I have actually got a statistical test paper that I published just recently, and I can send it to anybody here who'd like to take a look at it. I'll say a little more about that. So basically, therefore, on statistical grounds, I've concluded that the book required superhuman knowledge and authorship. You could say, well, maybe one person did this, one human being, but I don't think he was using, or she was using her own information. This is something that had to be of superhuman origin because it demonstrates superhuman knowledge. And I can make that very specific. I taught statistics a bunch of times and thought of a way to test the hypothesis that the Urantia Book was written by humans. And it took me a long time to simplify the test. Otherwise, there's too much data collection because every one of these 48 examples has a different probability of it. Let me give you an example of the type of thing I'm talking about. The Piltdown Man hoax was something that wasn't really challenged until the early 1950s. There were 500 scholarly articles, more than 500 scholarly articles written about the Piltdown Man. The Urantia Book mentions several of the fossils, Heidelberg, Cro-Magnon, Java, doesn't mention the Piltdown Man. In fact, it says, Piltdown Man, if you know anything about it, it was the jaw of an ape with the and teeth of a human, or maybe it was the other way around, but they had fabricated this, it was put together. And people believed it for a long time. We didn't have many fossil records. If the Urantia book had said anything about Piltdown Man, would I be here? I don't think so, because it would have discredited it, in my estimation. If they'd give me false statements, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the truth. Let me go into this a little bit more. How did I do it? Let's take this wooden chair in a forest example. To run a statistical test, one must already have some prior knowledge of the distribution associated with what we call the null hypothesis. For example, knowing that wood can hardly grow unaided into the shape of a four-legged chair in a wooded forest, if we encounter such a piece of wood in the forest, then we're justified in concluding statistically, not logically, that it was designed and built by some intelligent agent, rather than that it evolved or emerged into a chair by wholly non-intelligent means. In this case, we have an a priori probability distribution, namely wood growing naturally in a forest, to test against. And we all have seen that, and if you saw that chair, or that wood in the forest, you would have said, somebody built that, somebody made that. You wouldn't say, oh gosh, that's really a very interesting tree. You wouldn't say that. You'd say this was a chair. Well, the same thing can be done in other circumstances. Here's let's suppose you have a coin, and you flip the coin n times. Well, if n is 5, then you're going to get this kind of distribution. If you do it over and over and over again, you're going to get this kind of a distribution. If n is 100, then you're going to get this kind of a distribution, this blue. Well, if you flip a coin 100 times, you expect to get about 50. You might get 45, you might get 55, you might get 40 or 60. When you get down to 35 or 65, you're down to under 1% of the time. If you took 100 pennies and you threw them on the floor, that would probably be just as good as one at a time. And you could see that sure enough, almost every time you're going to get in that range. Now, suppose you take a coin and you flip it, and you find that you get, 30 or 20 heads and 80 tails. The probability of that is so small, you would statistically suspect there's something unbalanced about this coin. Now, you couldn't logically prove that, because it is possible to do it. To flip a coin 100 times and get 80 tails. But don't spend your time trying that, because you'll do that all your life. So that's the basic idea that I used to check the science that had been discovered between 1955 and whenever I did this was not too long ago, 2005. Here's a picture of old science. Here are some science that occurred before 55, but which was wrong, and who corrected them. And they're the dates. These are things that people used to think, but now we know are false. And they were fixed by the scientists who discovered the truth. Here's some science that's discovered since 55. Okay? All of this has been, documented. Here's the Piltdown Man slide, and here's the statement. Although the evolution of vegetable life can be traced into animal life, and though there have been found graduated series of plants and animals which progressively lead from the most simple to the most complex advanced organisms, you will not be able to find such connecting links between the great divisions of the animal kingdom, nor between the highest and the pre-human animal types and the dawn men of the human races. These so-called missing links, which the Piltdown Man was supposed to be, will forever remain missing for the simple reason they never existed. Now, why would they say something like that? I mean, we're looking for it. We thought we found it. They're saying, no, you didn't. Almost all scientists in the field were fooled by, including Henry F. Osborn and William Gregory. They were when the second fossil. There were two of them. The second one really convinced people. This is 1917. Literally hundreds of scholarly articles, few skeptics. If the Urantia Book took Piltdown Man seriously, it would have discredited. Continental Drift was another example. The ridicule heaped on Alfred Wegener was really quite heavy, as documented by the University of California, Berkeley Museum of Paleontology and the NASA Earth Observatory and references. You know how demeaning many scientists can be toward scientific crackpots and scientific pioneers alike. But the Urantia Book treats continental drift systematically as part of its earth science. Were that basically a false theory, and it was the minority position up until the 60s, the early 60s, they would have taken the wrong side, and it would have been a little hard to swallow this as an authoritative elimination of error. Mountains and earthquakes is another example. The Urantia Book describes how these things happened, where the Rocky Mountains showed up from, when, they described the whole thing, and they did it in 1955 or earlier. We're just getting around to agreeing. One of the most dramatic examples is the statement that they make in 1955 that in the not-too-distant future, new telescopes will reveal to the wondering gaze of Urantia astronomers no less than 375 million new galaxies in the remote stretches of outer space. And then they talk about relatively quiet zones in between. And now we know that there are these huge gaps in between, or these outer space observations. So they predicted the galaxies. They predicted the big zones of quietude. They corroborated neutrinos when they were still theoretical, and they also stated that they had mass, but that was only described in 1998. And they described how the integrity of the nucleus is maintained by the mesotron, now we call them mesons, in which the charge is flipped back and forth between the proton and the neutron, so that there's no separating. They just managed to keep it together that way. These are described in the Urantia Book in 1955. Well, there's also the revealed cosmology of the spirit. And we've gone through a lot of that earlier. There's the divine spirit, the mortal mind, and the soul. And the concept of the Urantia mind and the material bridge between our level and pure spirit. They talk about a whole different kind of material that has been fabricated so that we could sort of, by levels, get from almost purely material to a little more spiritual, until finally we become totally spiritual. And then, of course, we still have a lot of evolution to do. Byron talked about the Supreme Being. This is the finite unification God. And we're part of that. We help the Supreme, and the Supreme helps us, and it's all culminating in eventually the whole of the master universe, or the grand universe, being settled in light and life. Then we'll go out into those outer space levels, and the phenolaters will no longer be final. They'll be phenolaters, but things will no longer be that they're not going to grow anymore, because there'll be something greatly new. And of course, there's the gospel of Jesus according to the Urantia Book. And again, this has been gone over earlier, so I'll get past it quickly here. But the evolution of the person is what's very important in the Urantia Book. That's what they need us to know. So we'll get to the eternal universe of Havona. We'll get to paradise. We'll actually get to be in the personal presence of the universal Father, the first person of reality. God is personalized in three persons, but otherwise God has other than personal manifestations. I'll end in this one. I've got some references, but there's no point in putting that up there and leaving it there. I'll end in this one. If man recognized that his creators, his immediate supervisors, while being divine, were also finite, and that God, the God of time and space, was an evolving and non-absolute deity, then would the inconsistencies of temporal inequalities cease to be profound religious paradoxes. No longer would religious faith be prostituted to the promotion of social smugness in the fortunate, while serving only to encourage stoical resignation in the unfortunate victims of social deprivation. So the Urantia Book gives us a reason to want to improve ourselves and improve the universe. All right, let me
we have a few minutes for questions for Phil. While we're waiting, I have a question for you. It's actually just a kind of a personal question about rotation.
Yeah.
Why does everything have to rotate in the first place? You know, it seems because it's why doesn't it just sit there? Why does it rotate? Why do all things rotate? I never thought of that. I mean, what would be the answer?
There's a balance between the center and the periphery, and there's an attraction. And the only way you can keep if the Earth wasn't orbiting the sun, it would just go into the sun. But because it orbits, it's moving this way, but the sun pulls it back. And it's moving that way on a straight line, but the sun pulls it back. So it eventually goes in a circle. So it's a way to hold things together.
That helps. Since there's nobody else, come on up here. We'll have to come all the way up. You have to come up to the microphone. I stand corrected. I was indicating that Havona is outside of space and time, but I was wrong about that. So, but the paradise is outside of space and time.
Yes.
So, if anybody cares, the center of the universe is outside of space-time, but the periphery of Havona is in space, but we just can't see it because of these bodies that block the light. So
or actually just, move the light around, I think. They cloak it.
Hi. So I know the Urantia Book talks about solar energy, but I can't remember in my history if we were actually cognizant of solar energy back in 1955. Was that one of the newer
The Urantia Book
forms.
is very big in solar energy.
Yeah.
It says that, in Chicago, it literally mentions the city and says that if we had all the energy that falls on Chicago at, I think, 4 cents a kilowatt hour or something, that it would be a huge amount of money in one day. So we're not getting all the energy. I mean, we're not even aware of all the energy that the sun is sending here. And even what we have is probably can be very much improved in terms of changing that sun's light and energy into electricity. So yeah, it speaks very highly about solar. It says, in fact, while you explore, nuclear, solar is really the way to go. So, yeah.
Did I hear you correctly when you said, I thought I heard you say, that the Urantia material predicts that humanity was created by not a supreme God, but some lesser divinities, or could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, okay. Well, we're not so simple, are we? We have personality, we have soul, we have mind, we have material bodies. Our personality comes directly from the first person, God the Father. Our minds come from the infinite spirit, and the local universes. I should mention that the way the Urantia Book describes our creation here is that the paradise son and daughter, Byron mentioned, the creator's son and the creative spirit, they leave paradise and they come into space. Now, space is already here, and also the material is already here, but there's no life. She comes in and secures an area, or has a presence, and he's there too, and they initiate life there after building some architectural worlds. They initiate life, but this is finite life by these non-absolute beings. They're the children of God, paradise children. They come out here and they initiate evolutionary life. And then, so our life, our physical material is really already here. Our mind comes from the local universe's spirit, mother spirit, and our souls come from the combined action of the indwelling spirit from the Father again, and our own individual mind, and the combination of that is the soul, which is the embryo for our future life.
I just wanted to add that there are particular beings, Beverly. This is Beverly Rubik, who's a distinguished scientist, who asked the question. There are particular beings called life carriers that are sort of like super chemists.
Who are children of the paradise, of the Creator, Son, and Mother Spirit.
And they're created by fiat, like many beings, by the pair of Christ Michael and Mother Spirit. Their special ability is to actually experiment with life, change its pattern, and then plant that new tweaked kind of life form on a new planet that's ready, that's developing an atmosphere that has water, etc. So each inhabited planet is planted with life by these beings called life carriers. It's kind of a descriptive.
And the life is actually designed to go with the planet, not the other way around. In other words, they say, okay, this planet has atmosphere, we'll put this kind of life. This planet doesn't have atmosphere, we'll put in non-breathers, they talk about. This planet has a lot of water, we'll make them swim around. So they say you would be amazed at the variety of humanoid life.
I skipped my slide that showed that there, I think it states that 70% of inhabited planets are inhabited by humanoid bipeds that breathe. but I think something like 10% of planets or less, maybe less,
It's less. It's about
less.
1.5% of non-breathers.
have no atmosphere, so they do not breathe at all. They're non-breather planets. And a small percentage are what they call super breathers. They're like Venus. So a place like Venus.
The atmosphere is that way. They say if there was life on Venus, there would be a super breather.
That's a type of being.
And on Mars, it would be a sub-breather.
Sub-breather.
And then they say, without any air, it would be a non-breather. And there are only very, very, very few of them. But then they say something which has always intrigued me. And you would be more than interested in hearing about such a race, because a race of such non-breathers lives in close proximity to your sphere. And I've been wondering, well, when are we going to discover these non-breathers? Of course, we're not looking for non-breathers. We're looking for humanoids like us. You often hear, well, life isn't possible on that world because there's no air. Well, maybe we're underestimating God's possibilities.
These life carriers design life, as we're saying, if they say this planet looks pretty good, doesn't have an atmosphere, we're going to plant single cell entities that will evolve to be non-breathers on a planet with no atmosphere. So they have the ability to design such forms of life.
They're
Use
electrical.
photosynthesis.
They're
or whatever.
electrical, they say.
And also
energized.
there are aquatic planets where it's entirely underwater. The humanoid beings are aquatic. It's a small percentage. So there's an elaborate answer to the question. There's a whole chapter on these beings called life carriers. It's a really amazing reading. One more? Two more.
You spoke of particles that have an intention and that are programmable with an axis. What were they called?
Ultimatons. Well,
Ultimatons.
Most particles spin and orbit.
I understand those to be adamantine particles. Are they the same, and do they have adamantine particles? Am I thinking that they may be one and the same, and do they have a source?
No, I've never heard that. Adamantine?
Adamantine particles is what I understand those to be in my own thoughts of something.
I've never
very
heard
similar.
of that term, I don't think.
Yeah.
Perhaps. And do they have a source?
The source of ultimatons?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I described how the Urantia Book talks about the fact that the unqualified absolute pervades space, and then when these transcendental force organizers are present, somehow this force starts to become, present in space, and then they work with it. These are special beings. They work with it to get a global attraction to the center, and they pass it off to another stage where they take that and turn it into particles. I mentioned how does a particle, an ultimate particle, stay together if it's spinning on its axis, which is what they say. The ultimatons are minute spheres. They have axial rotations that are very rapid, to say the least. And somehow they're held together, and I think they're held together by the nucleus, which is paradise. After all, God is in paradise, and in God all things consist and have their being. If that's the case, then every material must have a spiritual nucleus.
Thank you.
Sounds like the Higgs boson.
Maybe so.
I just wanted to add something to that. The adamantine notion, I've heard of that from certain channeled systems. It's the irreducible matter, that there's no something subatomic, sub that.
Yeah,
right? So
yeah. They refer to how
the same
the
idea.
ultimatons individuate, and at one point they say, well, in this process, it's not enough energy to de-individuate them. So the ultimatons are the initial individual particles of energy, and then of course they get put together, and they say there's 100 ultimatons to an electron.
Important.
And we're not sure exactly how they go together. Some of us think they're sort of huddled together, and tended to think that these 100 ultimatons are rings that are concentric and they rotate in opposite directions.
It doesn't say that.
But, well, there's an awful lot of opposite direction spins. So, you add a little bit of something and maybe it's right. But there's a lot of alternate directions in the cosmos. The 4 outer space zones alternate in their directions. And we rotate, we orbit in one direction or spin in the outer space realms. The first one goes in the opposite direction. Well, that would provide for a more stable angular momentum. You still have the energy because but you wouldn't have, I mean, think of it this way. If you have a wheel spinning this way and you have an inner wheel spinning the other way, then you've got some balance there as opposed to both of them spinning the same way. Yeah. It's just a sort of a physical thing.
I just wanted to ask you on behalf of everybody, so there's beings who extract ultimatons out of the quantum vacuum, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a variety of beings that do that. But I don't think it was clear to folks that these are actual personal beings who are in space and who initiate nebula. And the way I picture it is they go like this.
They have something
and they create
called
a vortex. And out of that comes these ultimatons, and then out of that comes matter, right? Is that correct?
Roughly. I mean, they describe these are transcendental force organizers. So they're not in time. I think that the Urantia Book's cosmology is more steady state. All the space, all of Avona appeared when the infinite spirit appeared, which was essentially all the time. So they describe a steady state universe, not an exploding one, but it is breathing. There's a certain respiration of space that they say is in 2 billion year cycles. We didn't mention that. But that is part of the expansion. And they also say that we're in the phase of maximum acceleration, because this goes out, goes back, and goes out. Well, when it's in the middle, it's actually accelerating right over here before it gets to the midpoint, and then it starts slowing down. So it's accelerating, and they say we're in that phase. We're in a sort of a maximum acceleration space. That could be the reason why we're seeing acceleration of space expansion.